What's up, heathens? How y'all doing? I'm the Godless engineer, and I critically analyze apologists' claims to give you the best arguments and information so that you can stand up and use your voice. Today we're going to be taking a look at David Wood ranting against Jesus mythicism. And let me tell you, he has very little self-awareness, and he seems to only be able to work in arguments from authority.
A Jesus myther might just as reasonably throw himself on the floor of the checkout aisle at Walmart because his mommy wouldn't buy him a pack of Skittles. I asked Dr. Mike Licona, Dr. Gary Habermas, and Dr. William Lane Craig what they think about Jesus mythers.
Historians today regard the existence of Jesus as a done deal. It's indisputable. In fact, professional historians and biblical scholars would view those who would deny the existence of Jesus to be on the same, in the same kind of camp as Holocaust deniers and those who think we never went to the moon.
Whew. David is not going to look good in this video. If you want to see how bad his arguments are for the historical Jesus, then please stay tuned. Alright, heathens, well, before we get into the video today, I do want to implore you guys to go check out my app on the app stores called Crestus. If you want the best information about why Jesus is probably a myth and he probably never existed, that is the best resource you can pick up. There will be links down in the description as well as in the cards and on the end screen if you want to check it out. One important thing to note about the app is that it's supported by peer-reviewed scholarship on this very topic. This is not just some random research done by a YouTube atheist, whether me or somebody else, on this particular topic. And it's not just any scholarship, it's critical scholarship of this topic. Today, David Wood is going to get into this particular topic by trying to classify, one, all atheists as being conspiracy theorists, and two, as Jesus mythicists being total fools and also conspiracy theorists. So let's see what David Wood has for us.
If you're watching this, you probably believe that I exist. But if, for some reason, you didn't want to believe that I exist, you could explain away all evidence of my existence. Perhaps I'm a hologram or CGI. Perhaps you're dreaming. Perhaps powerful mind-manipulating aliens are tricking you into thinking that I exist. Human beings are amazingly adept at explaining away evidence for things they don't want to believe in.
This will be the start of David Wood and his lack of self-awareness. David is obviously a Christian who believes in the resurrection of a Jew in the first century. In order to do this, he has to explain away a lot of evidence and make up ad hoc arguments for why they shouldn't be considered. What David Wood, as well as other people in the apologetics empire, try to do is flip the tables on atheists and try to make them seem like they are the ones that are accepting crazy, outlandish ideas. In reality, atheists in general just look for the truth and don't let some apologists tell them what to think. Instead, we try to seek for the actual truth of the matter.
That's why we have Holocaust deniers, moon landing conspiracy theorists, flat earthers, and of course, atheists.
So you see, David Wood starts off by classifying all atheists as conspiracy theorists. And he does this because he thinks it's a conspiracy theory not to believe in God. This is the first time I've actually heard him lump atheists in with conspiracy theorists, but he definitely thinks atheists are crazy for thinking that God either doesn't exist, they're not convinced that he exists, or just simply don't believe that Jesus resurrected from the dead. And in this first little section here, what David does is he tries to make it seem like atheists just don't want to believe in the God of the Bible or Jesus. He then tries to suggest that that is the reason why Jesus mythicists are mythicists, which we'll get to here in a second.
If you fall into one of those camps, please feel free to cry me a river in the comments section. Religion is an emotionally charged topic for many people, and when it comes to religion, no one is as emotional as the people who are often described as the new atheists. Since emotion can cloud our judgment, it's become increasingly common to find these atheistic lumps of outrage trolling social media platforms claiming that Jesus never existed.
Now, I want to preface here that even in the atheist community, mythicism is very much a minority position to hold. Of course, within the mythicist position, you have a bunch of other crazy ideas that seem to gain some traction, but that's why I'm trying to be a very positive voice for mythicism, where I rely solely on peer-reviewed scholarship. If a certain hypothesis or idea really doesn't pass peer-reviewed muster, then I'm not going to accept it because it doesn't seem to make sense. There's this one popular idea of a Claudian Christ. That's where apparently it's Jesus that existed in the 50s, and he was actually the Egyptian. There's little to no evidence to support this particular idea, or at least differentiate it from the Gospels just making up things, or some of the Gospel writers using Josephus in order to pad out their Gospels with some historical details. Since this particular hypothesis really doesn't make a lot of sense with the evidence that we have, I simply don't accept it. And there are plenty of mythicist positions out there that I don't accept. I go with minimal mythicism. But what David Wood is saying right here is that new atheists are synonymous with mythicists, and that's just a hasty generalization.
Now, it's one thing to be skeptical of Jesus' virgin birth or his resurrection from the dead, but to be skeptical of his existence? To think that Christianity took off in the first century without an actual person named Jesus to set things in motion? To be so angry at Jesus because your parents made you go to church when you were a kid that you become a reality-denying hyper-skeptic who spends all his time posting, "I just don't find the evidence convincing," on Facebook?
Well, no. To suggest that for some reason I hate Jesus, therefore I suggest that he never existed, is putting a lot of motive and intention on me that I simply don't exhibit. I don't hate Jesus or the story of Jesus or anything like that. So to suggest that that is a reason why I deny his existence in general is just disingenuous, and it kind of makes you an asshole. I also don't think that it's hyper skeptic in order to want evidence for a claim that I make. If I'm going to say Jesus existed in history, then I'm going to want some evidence to actually support that. And I'm not going to rely on apologist arguments that are the exact same quality of argument that is used for the resurrection. This would come in the form of eyewitness testimony or contemporaneous accounts of things that would have been around at the time that Jesus supposedly existed. We would expect even some incidental things that would point towards him existing. But every time I look at the evidence, I just find that it's either too ambiguous to point in one direction or another, or it doesn't actually support his existence. So call me hyper-skeptic all that you want to and think that I'm a fool and I'm crazy for going against scholarship, but the scholarship is dominated by Christians who think that a Jew resurrected from the dead in the first century. And they do this with the exact same arguments that they use for the historical Jesus.
A Jesus myther might just as reasonably throw himself on the floor of the checkout aisle at Walmart because his mommy wouldn't buy him a pack of Skittles.
I wanted to stop it right here because this is just another piece of evidence of David and his lack of self-awareness. This doesn't really describe mythicists. If you're trying to make an analogy here, it doesn't really work at all. You don't see mythicists really throwing their arms up in the air on the internet or anything like that because they're bothered by the idea that somebody thinks that Jesus existed. I actually have no problem with people thinking that he existed, especially due to the fact that most scholars accept that he did. That's a perfectly fine reason to believe that Jesus existed, but if you're going to argue for his existence, then you need actual arguments in order to support your claim that he did exist. So while I don't mind people believing that Jesus existed due to the majority of scholarship believing that he did, if you're going to argue for his existence, then you need to have arguments that refute my position of that he probably didn't exist. But also in this analogy here, it seems to fit more with Christians than it does with mythicists. Because you see Christians all the time throwing a fit because they're not given preferential treatment. It's just like they threw themselves down on the floor because their mom wouldn't allow them to get the Skittles. Now, I don't sit here and make childish analogies like that, but you're going to see that David Wood loves these little childish analogies.
But don't take my word for it. I asked Dr. Mike Licona, Dr. Gary Habermas, and Dr. William Lane Craig what they think about Jesus mythers.
Every once in a while, some people will propose that Jesus never existed. It lasts for a little while and then it goes away. That Jesus did exist is very well attested in the historical literature. It is mentioned by a number of non-Christian sources. For example, Jesus is mentioned by Josephus. Tacitus mentions Jesus. Lucian of Samosata mentions him. Marabar Serapion mentions Jesus. The Talmud mentions him.
So, I don't think that Josephus actually wrote about Jesus, but I have plenty of videos here on my channel that discuss that. So if you're interested in those arguments, I definitely suggest you go and watch those. Or you can get the Crestus app and you will see basically why I don't think that Josephus actually wrote about Jesus. Now, the other people that Mike mentions here being Tacitus, Lucian, and Marabar Serapion, all of those guys got their information from the existing Christian community, either from interviews or interrogations of them or by the Gospels themselves. And we know this because critical scholarship has taken a look at it and has shown that you cannot separate those particular sources from the Gospels. So they are not independent sources whatsoever.
Josephus mentions the martyrdom of James, the brother of Jesus, who was called the Christ. Again, it's very difficult to have someone who's a brother of someone who did not exist.
Well, I don't think that James was actually a brother of Jesus. That all stems from the words that Paul uses right there, namely adelphos. Everywhere in Paul's work, he only uses adelphos in a fictive kinship manner. So it seems like on the evidence that we have, it's more likely that Paul meant a fictive kinship when he was talking about this brother of the Lord, James. Again, I have plenty of videos here on my channel about that particular topic as well.
In addition, we have a number of Christian sources who mention Jesus. We have multiple independent sources with the Gospels. You have Paul, the letters of Paul. You have the book of Hebrews. You have other New Testament literature. These are multiple independent sources, and although they're a Christian, you just can't discount them because they're Christian.
Well, I would agree that you can't just discount them because they're Christian, but you can discount all of those sources except for Paul because they all depend upon Paul. Paul is the one source that you have listed out of all of those that suggests that he even existed, let alone was crucified. All of the other materials that you talk about there, the Christian sources, derive off of Paul's visions and his interpretation of Scripture. So that would be the reason why I discount the majority of those sources. I don't discount Paul because he's our only near contemporaneous source that could have witnessed either Jesus or the disciples, yet he doesn't mention the disciples at all, nor does he mention an earthly Jesus, at least explicitly.
Well, definitely I think Jesus existed. But if I were going to give just a kind of a general kind of response, I'd say big picture, little picture. Big picture from about 1990 with the work of Richard Burridge on the Gospels, and the predominant view in New Testament study today being that the Gospels are in the genre of Greco-Roman bios or biography. That doesn't mean there can't be anything in there that, it doesn't mean the Greeks and Romans don't tell funny little tales sometimes, but it makes the genre is not a fantasy genre, it's a potentially historical genre. So big picture is, with the Gospels, we've got the right data. Specific picture, you're going to have to zero in on the small cases, the so-called red letter words, and some of the key events in Jesus' life. You're going to have to zero in on them and say, all right, did this healing take place? Why? Did this exorcism take place? Why? Did he die on the cross? Why? Was he buried? Where and why? Was he raised from the dead? Who saw him? And what happened to the early church after the resurrection? All those are specific questions for which we have specific data. So I'd say big picture, right genre. Little picture, yeah, we're able to go in there with tweezers and pick out those individual events.
So basically what Habermas is saying here is that the Gospels are eyewitness accounts, which we know that they aren't, and it's actually the majority of scholarship that identifies the Gospels as not being eyewitness accounts. There are actually much, much later accounts that use Paul as well as other sources in order to generate their narratives. Most likely, Mark modeled his narrative off of Jesus ben Ananias. There are 23 similarities between Jesus ben Ananias' life and the life of Jesus as recorded in Mark. We also see the other Gospels copying off of Mark, as well as each other. So basically what Gary Habermas is telling you here is that on a big picture scale, you can trust the Gospels to be eyewitness accounts, when that's not even true. And then on the small scale, he's asking us to go in with tweezers and look at the very fine print of what the Gospels say. If all of the Gospels agree one thing happened, then that particular thing happened. He uses this same kind of logic to prove that miracles happened and were done by Jesus. So essentially, Gary Habermas is using the same methodology and the same quality of evidence to prove that miracles definitely happened, were definitely done by Jesus, who was also crucified and resurrected. You can understand my skepticism when the exact same logic and evidence can be used to prove that supernatural miracles happen as well as Jesus existing. I feel like there has to be some delineation between the logic there in order to validate that Jesus existed.
I would say those who think that Jesus of Nazareth never existed are well over 100 years out of date.
Like Bart Ehrman says famously, he says, if Jesus was crucified, he existed. And since we know he was crucified, he obviously existed, and all those who say he didn't exist are just wrong.
Well, to William Lane Craig, I would say I feel like you're out of date. I mean, you're currently writing a book on the historical Adam. So I feel like you're very out of date with a lot of critical scholarship. Now, to Gary Habermas here, I agree. This logic seems sound up front, but you have to ask yourself at each particular argument, do we have evidence to support it? So Jesus Christ was crucified. What do we have to suggest that he was crucified? All we have is Paul. Paul is the only source that ever claims that he was crucified, at least the only independent source. People like Gary Habermas and Bart Ehrman are going to consider the Gospels to be independent testimonies of Jesus' life. So they would include those as independent accounts of him being crucified. But since we can't separate Paul as being a source for these accounts in the Gospels, that means that we really only have Paul as a source. Gary's argument right here fails at the very first premise, being that Jesus was crucified, and we can't substantiate that with evidence.
Historians today regard the existence of Jesus as a done deal. It's indisputable.
And it's true that we could say the resurrection is not proven if we're defining proof as 100%. But I'd also be very quick to add that the same could be said about every ancient event. In fact, it could be said about every historical event, because you could always come up with some sort of an alternate explanation.
In fact, professional historians and biblical scholars would view those who would deny the existence of Jesus to be on the same, in the same kind of camp as Holocaust deniers and those who think we never went to the moon.
So what Mike Licona there did was he used two different fallacies. The first fallacy was an argument from authority. Now, a lot of people are mistaken about the argument from authority because that is an actual fallacy. They normally confuse it with an argument from false authority. That would be a situation where somebody from a completely separate field gives their opinion on another field that they aren't proficient in. So basically, they're just using an authority that doesn't really have authority in that field. But the argument from authority utilizes authorities in the field, but what they do is they only cite the authorities as proof that some claim is true, like in this case, that Jesus existed. So with Mike Licona, he's proposing that Jesus definitely existed and is completely foolish to even question his existence because a lot of people with authority in the field believe that he did. Another fallacy that he's using here is a poisoning the well fallacy. He's lumping mythicists in with these conspiracy theorists as a way to denigrate our position, when in fact the conspiracy theorists, they take a nugget of truth and they extrapolate out without any underlying evidence to support their conclusions, whereas I have supporting evidence for my conclusions. Mike would think that I'm wrong about my conclusions, but there's no way that he could deny the evidence that I have.
See, I told you. But there's an additional perspective that's often missing from discussions of the historical evidence for Jesus' existence. Historians mention Josephus and the Talmud as references, but there's a larger Jewish history to consider. The early Christians, many of whom were Jewish, accused the Jewish leaders of conspiring to hand Jesus over to the Romans for crucifixion. Can you imagine these early Christians pointing a finger at the Jewish leaders for their role in Jesus' execution if the Jewish leaders had no idea what Christians were talking about because Jesus was a mythical figure?
Well, so what David is not telling you right here is that this particular argument didn't crop up until about the 80s, or at least that's the earliest that we can pin it down. Now, did it more than likely start up like earlier than that? Sure. But the first instance that we have of an apologetic against that particular argument comes with Matthew. Matthew wasn't written until the 80s. So this particular argument against Jesus' resurrection didn't even exist in Paul's time because Paul never mentions it. He never mentions that anybody was being bribed or asked to be disingenuous about Jesus' empty tomb. We don't get this until much later. But of course, he is under the assumption, like Gary Habermas, Licona, and other apologists, that the Gospels are eyewitness accounts. So he assumes the accounts in the Gospels relay what actually happened in the first century, when in fact we know that they were using Paul in order to generate their narratives, but they were also making up new things on their own. In Matthew, this apologetic is put in because it was a popular argument against their resurrected deity. So they changed up the story a little bit and provided an apologetic for Christians. This is not a conspiracy theory because what we have is our earliest account, Mark, not even mentioning this. Our even earlier account of Paul doesn't even mention this. It's invented with Matthew.
Wouldn't we expect the classic Jewish response to Christianity to be something like, "What are you Christians talking about? We've never heard of this Jesus." And yet, that's just never been the Jewish response. Here's Dr. Michael Brown on the Jewish perspective.
Before we get into Michael Brown's perspective on this, Jesuses have existed in the Jewish culture for a while. And even in Zechariah in the Old Testament, especially in the Septuagint, you have Jesus as being the name of the Messiah to come and free the Israelite people and be their savior. The idea that they would have been like, we have no idea who Jesus is, really doesn't make sense when you consider the evidence that we have. Jesus is a prophetic name because it was Yeshua or Joshua, which was already an established prophetic name in the Old Testament. So everything that David is asserting here just literally makes no sense.
Well, of course he existed. That's really not in dispute. What's interesting is you have ancient Jewish traditions and recorded in the Talmud and what's called Midrashic literature, and they mention someone called Yeshu, and he's mentioned sometimes in a generation or two before when Jesus lived, or a generation or two after, and then the memories seem to be vague. So there's dispute about whether the authors of the Talmud actually knew of this Jesus. Did they put him in the wrong place? Is this referring to someone else? But as you go further on in Jewish history, when you get to Moses Maimonides in the 12th century, he just plainly talks about Jesus being given over to be killed and so on, and why Jews don't follow him. So through Jewish history, there's never really been dispute about his existence. And what's interesting also in the early Jewish literature, for example, 2nd, 3rd century, what's called the Tosefta, you have references to these Jewish sectarians who pray for you in Yeshua's name. And they're saying it's better to die than to have them pray for you because they were known for having a gift of healing. So the movement is there. There's no denial of it. It's an extreme skeptic only that questions whether he actually existed.
One key thing here with Dr. Michael Brown is you got to go back and listen because he admits that the Talmud places Jesus 100 years earlier or some years later than when the Jesus of Christianity was supposed to live. This is a really big problem because the claim of Christianity is that a man named Jesus started the Christian movement in the early 30s with his death and resurrection. The Talmud records a Jesus, but he exists 100 years prior to that. Now, he was killed, but all of his disciples that were following him were also killed. He also didn't resurrect, but that didn't stop the Jewish Christians at the time from forming a belief around this particular Jesus. What Dr. Michael Brown is doing here is he's playing an equivocation game. He's trying to suggest that it's ridiculous to think that Jesus never existed when you have the Talmud that records multiple Jesuses living in the first century and even before that. This is simply not what the claim of Christianity is. Then he goes to the 12th century to prove that the Jews never doubted that Jesus existed in history. By the 12th century, it's well established in theology that Jesus existed in the first century. Nobody doubted it at the time. I agree with that. And then he backtracks to like the 2nd or 3rd century saying that, there were these Jews that admitted that Jesus existed and prayed to Jesus or something like that. By the 2nd and 3rd century, it was already well established in the Christian community that Jesus existed, that he was persecuted, that he died on the cross, and that he resurrected. So it's not really a surprise that other people were considering Jesus to be a historical figure in the 2nd and 3rd century. Essentially, what we have here is Dr. Michael Brown using really bad evidence in order to say that Jesus existed in history. We wouldn't accept this kind of evidence for anybody else in historical studies. It only exists in Jesus' historical studies.
But maybe Dr. Mike Licona and Dr. Gary Habermas and Dr. William Lane Craig and Dr. Michael Brown are all biased in favor of Jesus' existence because they're Christians. Maybe they're incapable of being balanced and neutral, unlike the impartial and open-minded internet atheists who spend all their time moaning and wailing about religion on Twitter.
Well, Christians spend a lot of their time moaning and wailing about Jesus and how they're persecuted and how they're pretty much just not given privilege anymore in a lot of different situations. So I really don't see the difference here in your complaints with atheists and my complaints with Christians. So there's really no point in you to even bring this up. But also, I do think that they're very biased against it. I believe that their faith requires them to make these kinds of leaps in logic in order to get to their conclusions because they wholly believe in the faith. The thing with secular-minded people is that we don't have a faith to bind us to an idea. Whereas Gary Habermas, Michael Licona, Dr. Michael Brown, all of them, they do have a faith-based position that binds them to an idea. That causes them to say things like, oh, supernatural things definitely exist. The exact same arguments that they use to prove that miracles and the supernatural in general exist and happen even now is the same quality of evidence that they use to prove that Jesus existed in history.
Well, let's see what Dr. Bart Ehrman says when a Jesus myther tries to educate him.
I know in the crowds you all run around with, it's commonly thought that Jesus did not exist. Let me tell you, once you get outside of your conclave, there's nobody this is not even an issue for scholars of antiquity. It is not an issue for scholars of antiquity. There is no scholar in any college or university in the Western world who teaches classics, ancient history, New Testament, early Christianity, any related field who doubts that Jesus existed.
So basically, the best evidence that Bart Ehrman has for Jesus' existence is just an argument from authority. I get it that the majority of scholars out there right now agree that Jesus existed. I'm not disputing that, but I am disputing their evidence. So just citing that the scholars say something doesn't really provide evidence that that something is true. I want to get at the meat of the evidence. I've been looking at the meat of the evidence. So just providing some clip of Bart Ehrman appealing to the authorities that say that Jesus existed and trying to shut people out from even asking the question is only going to make me want to ask that question more.
Don't you just love that condescending tone? I know that in that little wheel of delusion you guys are running on, it's common to deny Jesus' existence. But once you get off that wheel, no one agrees with you. But why, Dr. Ehrman? Why is there a consensus on Jesus' existence?
The reason for thinking Jesus existed is because he is abundantly attested in early sources. That's why. And I give the details in my book. Early and independent sources indicate that certainly that Jesus existed. One author that we know about knew Jesus' brother and knew Jesus' closest disciple, Peter. He's an eyewitness to both Jesus' closest disciple and his brother.
So what Bart's not telling you here is that Paul never uses the word disciple to describe Peter. What he's talking about is Galatians 1:19, where he mentions James, the brother of the Lord, which I've already covered in this video. And if you want to learn more about it, definitely look in the cards to find the appropriate video for that. Basically, there's nothing in Paul's work that substantially proves that James was the brother of Jesus. And there's nothing in there to suggest that Paul got any of his information from Peter or the other apostles. In fact, in Galatians 1:11, he specifically says that he didn't get his information from any person here on earth. Now, the early sources that Bart Ehrman is talking about is like 1 Corinthians 15:3-8, where it's the Pauline Creed, and the Pauline Creed dates pretty early, like early 30s, I would say, is when that creed started. But just because the belief that he was crucified and resurrected started in the early 30s does not mean that Jesus actually lived in the early 30s or was crucified in the early 30s. It's the same kind of argument that these apologists use for saying that God definitely exists. Why would anybody believe that God exists if he doesn't exist? It's that kind of logic that they're using here.
That sounds exactly like what Christian scholars say. But if experts across the board, conservative Christian scholars, liberal Christian scholars, atheist scholars, agnostic scholars, Jewish scholars, if experts across the board agree that Jesus' existence is not in dispute, what should we think of the atheists who tell us that, based on their careful research on YouTube, they've concluded that Jesus never existed?
Well, if you guys remember how I started all of this out, my app, Crestus, as well as my own position, is based on scholarly, peer-reviewed work. So this is not just YouTube internet research. This is scholarly opinion that has been looked over to see if it makes sense. And the field of Jesus mythicism and scholarship is growing. There is a growing list of scholars out there who cannot for sure say that Jesus existed. Raphael Lataster, he takes an agnostic stance on whether or not Jesus existed. Of course, Richard Carrier is a mythicist himself, as well as many, many others. So no, David's assertion here that it's just internet atheism at its worst is not true.
I think that atheists have done themselves a disservice by jumping on the bandwagon of mythicism, because frankly, it makes you look foolish to the outside world. If that's what you're going to believe, you just look foolish. You are much better off going with historical evidence and arguing historically.
Someone call the burn unit.
Well, I mean, it's really funny that you say that, because that exact rhetoric can be used against you in every single position that you have. So I guess that's kind of a self-burn. Somebody call the burn unit. But more to the point, Bart Ehrman here is just trying to sway people away from the mythicist position because he doesn't feel like it's worth anybody's time investigating. When in fact, multiple people have shown that it's very much worth investigating, and that the field of Jesus historical studies is in really bad condition. They use really bad methods in order to prove their points. They use things like the criterion of embarrassment to prove that the tomb was empty and was found by women. Therefore, Jesus resurrected. It's the exact same quality of evidence that they use to prove a resurrection. The main difference between me as well as other mythicists out there is that we're not telling you to just trust the scholarship or trust any of that. We're telling you to look at the evidence for yourself and make up your own mind. Bart Ehrman, as well as apologists everywhere, don't want you asking this question because the evidence for Jesus' existence is so flimsy that it's really hard to swallow.
At the scholarly level, Jesus mythers are as rare as they are angry and biased. But since the internet is home to every insane theory under the sun, you're bound to run into Jesus mythers on various websites and platforms.
Oh, you mean like, universities and shit? Because that's where you find Raphael Lataster. He's got a history degree as well as Richard Carrier. That's far better than the apologists that you have on your side. Mike Licona is not a historian. Does he have degrees in relevant fields? Yes, he does. He's got a PhD in New Testament studies. But does he have a history degree? No, he doesn't. Gary Habermas, he doesn't have a history degree at all either. So You really don't have people that have history degrees that are critically looking at this topic. You have apologists. When he tells you that the majority of scholarship agrees that Jesus existed, the majority of these scholars are Christians and believe that he resurrected from the dead. Do you really want to be using the same kind and quality of evidence that is used to prove a resurrection? I know I don't. I want solid evidence in order to support the claim that Jesus existed.
They're going to challenge you to prove that Jesus existed. And if you accept the challenge, they're going to play skeptic while you present your evidence. I encourage you not to take the bait until you first show them the problem with their methodology. And it's very easy to show them the problem with their methodology. When a Jesus myther sends you a message and says, "Prove to me that Jesus exists," simply reply, "I'd be happy to prove to you that Jesus exists, but I don't want to present my evidence to a person who may not exist. So before I start giving you evidence, first prove to me that you exist." Then sit back and play skeptic. Whatever evidence the person gives for his own existence, just tell him that it's not enough and that you're not convinced. Offer alternative explanations of the evidence he's presenting. Say, maybe I'm hallucinating. Maybe I'm on drugs and I don't remember taking them. Maybe I'm the only thing that exists and I've invented you as a character to keep myself entertained. Maybe I'm just a brain in a vat and a mad scientist is sending me signals to make me think that you exist. Maybe I'm in the Matrix. Prove to me that I'm not in the Matrix. Prove it, prove it, prove it.
So basically, your advice to your audience, which numbers in the 400,000 range now, is to be very childish when interacting with other people over this topic and just what it seems to be like screaming, "Prove it, prove it, prove it," at them over text messages or whatever. You really want to teach your audience to become infantile in their conversations? Now, granted, this starts off with the false premise of the idea that mythicists just randomly message people asking them, "Hey, prove that Jesus existed." I mean, it may pop up in like conversation or whatever, but it's never going to be like a random person that jumps in and is like, in your DMs and is like, "Hey, prove Jesus existed." Like, if anybody starts off like that, they're obviously going to be an asshole about it. They're not going to be honest in their conversation. They're just looking to be an asshole. And if you come across somebody who just what seems to be screaming into the air, "Prove it, prove it, prove it that you exist," I mean, they're just being an asshole. And you probably shouldn't talk to him because it's pointless. So if David Wood is giving his audience advice on how to shut down conversation so that you can stay indoctrinated into your faith and hold on to bad arguments for your beliefs, then I guess you could take his advice. But I mean, even still, I feel like it's pretty infantile for you to react like that.
Once your atheist friend fails miserably, once he realizes that when you adopt his methodology, he can't even convince you of his own existence, perhaps he'll start looking for a better methodology. And once he adopts a better methodology, you'll have no problem convincing him that Jesus existed, because only a complete fool would reject the existence of Jesus of Nazareth.
So basically, in order to accept that Jesus existed in history, I have to use your bad methodology and your bad evidence in order to come to my conclusion. And until I do that, I won't come to the conclusion that Jesus existed. You know, honestly, I can't disagree that you have to use his bad methodology and bad evidence in order to come to the conclusion that Jesus existed. But I also want to point out how he wraps up this entire thing with another show of his lack of self-awareness. Because him talking about adopting another person's methodology in order to prove how ridiculous they are could be easily turned around on him. How about we use your methodology to prove that other religions are in fact true? My guess is that you would ad hoc come up with reasons why that's bad methodology, even though it's the exact same methodology that you use. Well, heathens, I appreciate you guys watching today. If you will, let me know what your thoughts are on David's arguments in this video. He put it up a little while ago, and the comments are as bad as you would think, but I would love to know what you guys think about his arguments. So let me know down below. While you're down there, make sure you smash that like button and subscribe if you like mythicist content like this. Don't forget to stand up and use your voice, and I will see you heathens later.